Alright, welcome to this review video. We're going to do incompatibilism, and just as a warning, like in the last video, this is not comprehensive. This is just going to give you an overview of what we did in class. So if you showed up regularly and filled out the handouts, there's going to be stuff in there that will be important to discuss on the exam, but that I won't touch on in this video. So here's the problem of free will. Determinism is true, first proposition. I have free will is the second proposition, and the third is, if determinism is true, then I have no free will. These three are mutually incompatible. We talked about that in class. They each seem plausible, so we have the makings of a paradox. We have to reject one of them. Incompatibilists all accept the third proposition, and so because one of them has to be rejected, incompatibilists then have a choice. They can either reject number one or number two, or in principle they could reject both, although few incompatibilists do that. But because they all accept three, they have to reject at least one or the other. And in accepting three, the incompatibilist is claiming that determinism and freedom are incompatible. If determinism is true, then we have no free will. Two different versions of incompatibilism. There's libertarian incompatibilism, which accepts three, as all incompatibilists do, and then also endorses two. So the libertarian says determinism rules out freedom if it were true, but I do have free will. So I conclude determinism must be false, because if it were true, it would rule out freedom. But I do have freedom, so determinism's got to go. That's the libertarian incompatibilist. The hard incompatibilist, who we spent less time on, but it's worth knowing, the hard incompatibilist agrees with the libertarian that yes, determinism rules out freedom, but the hard incompatibilist is so committed to determinism that they decide, I guess there is no free will, because determinism's true, and I think that determinism and freedom are irreconcilable. The one to go is freedom and responsibility. What we're going to look at today is not an argument for either libertarian or hard incompatibilism in particular. Instead, we're going to look at an influential argument simply for three. That is, simply for the claim that determinism's truth would rule out freedom. It's then going to be an open question, left unsettled by the argument, which version of incompatibilism you want to accept if you're convinced by the argument. So why think incompatibilism is true? Why accept that third proposition? Well, in motivating the three propositions that make up the problem of free will, I gave a sort of brief, and Van Inwagen does too, a kind of brief intuitive defense of the claim that determinism rules out freedom. And this, I think, intuitive defense captures the reason why many of you coming to this debate were very certain that determinism is incompatible with freedom. And it's not quite an argument, but it's an intuition, or a series of intuitions. And what Van Inwagen's argument for incompatibilism is going to do, it's going to be the topic of this video, is it's going to take those series of intuitions and turn them into something a little bit more logically rigorous. So what are these intuitions? What is the incompatibilist's intuition? Here's the thought. If I have no control over the factors that cause my decisions and actions, then I have no control over my decisions and actions. So I think that on the slide there, that should say, if I have no control, not if I do have control. So if you think about the paradigm cases of individuals who we think lack freedom, these are people who are under physical coercion from external forces. These are people who are addicted to a substance. These are people who are suffering from a neurosis, for example, or maybe just like physically restrained, like locked in a jail cell. What those all have in common is that the person's behavior, and sometimes their decisions too, are being causally influenced by factors over which they have no control. They don't control the chemical effects of the drug that they're addicted to. They can't control the fact that the jail cell is unable to be broken out of. They can't control the fact that there's a guy who's has a gun to their head, or is threatening them with some kind of physical force, right? The things that are impinging on their actions are things over which they have no control. That is why we think that those individuals have no freedom, or another way to put it is that is why we think those individuals have no control over their actions. If you don't have control over what causes your actions, then you don't have control over your actions either. The thought is that if determinism is true, then I have no control over the factors that cause any of my decisions or actions. Why? Well, because determinism says that the distant past and the laws of nature guarantee or determine the state of the world in the subsequent moment. And when you chain those series of determinations together and eventually reach my own actions, the result is that factors going on long before I was born and over which I have no control are causally determining my actions. As a result, so the incompatibilist thinks, I have no control over my decisions and actions because they're being caused by factors outside my control, namely the laws of nature and the state of the distant past. That is the sort of simple version, I think, of why most people, when they come to this debate for the first time, are absolutely convinced that freedom and determinism are incompatible. Van Inwagen's argument is an attempt to take this intuition and refine it and make it more logically rigorous and turn it into something more than just an intuition. So this is Peter Van Inwagen. He's a professor at the University of Notre Dame. This argument has appeared in various forms since the mid-1970s when he published a paper in Philosophical Studies called The Incompatibility of Free Will and Determinism. He then developed this argument a little bit in a lot more detail in his book, An Essay on Free Will. This argument is often in the literature called the consequence argument. The presentation he gives in the chapter that we read, which is a little more accessible, is the untouchability argument. Essentially, the untouchability argument is just a simplified and accessible version of the consequence argument. So if you continue to be interested in this, and you do some reading and encounter the consequence argument discussed somewhere, that's the untouchability argument. Okay, so a bit of background before we lay out the untouchability argument. First is the concept of an untouchable fact. So here's what Van Inwagen says. He gives the example of a safe that's locked. And he notes that a safe that is locked and to which you don't have the key, right? Or the combination. He's like, in a sense, there's nothing you can do to change what's inside the safe. If you had the key or the combination, then you would be able to open up the safe and take out whatever's in there or put in something different. But as a matter of fact, you don't have the combination or the key, so you can't do anything right now to open it up and change what's inside of it. In principle, though, it's conceivable that you or someone else at some point could have the power to open up that safe. Had you counterfactually gotten the key, had someone else, presumably the owner of the safe, they have the key or the combination, someone somewhere has the power to open up this safe and change what's inside of it. By contrast, so Van Inwagen says, no knowledge and no fantastic stroke of luck would render you able to do anything about the shape of the earth. So unlike the safe that's locked where you can't do anything about it, but someone could, no one, including you, no matter what knowledge or power you had, would be able to change the shape of the earth. The physical properties of iron, the distant past, or the arithmetical properties of a number. These are untouchable facts. So he says, let us understand X can't do anything about Y and could never have in the following strong sense. X can't do anything about Y and never could have, no matter what knowledge X might have had and no matter how lucky X might have been. In this very strong sense, it remains true that there are facts that no human being can do anything about and that no human being in history could ever have done anything about. The 4 facts I've cited, of course, an enormous number of others. Let us call these untouchable facts. So for our purposes, we can understand an untouchable fact as follows. This is just a fact that no one has ever had the power to change. Examples: the shape of the earth, the fact that 2 + 2 is 4, the fact that dinosaurs once roamed the earth. That's a physical fact, so unlike the mathematical case, you might think, well, if it's physical, then someone could change it. But obviously, there weren't human beings around when there were dinosaurs, and so the fact that the dinosaurs roamed the earth, barring time travel, is something that no human could ever do anything about. I also just want to note that some conditional facts are untouchable. This is going to be important. For example, the fact that if God exists, then there's no unjustifiable evil or no gratuitous evil. That's an if-then claim. If God exists, then there's no gratuitous evil. But no one can do anything to change that. The theist might wish really hard that if only God's existence were compatible with gratuitous evil, no one can do anything to change that fact. Or think of if something is bilateral, if something is trilateral, then it's triangular, right? That's like a basic definitional geometric truth. But it's an if-then claim, and it's the kind of if-then claim that no one has the power to change. We can discover these things and articulate them, but we can't change them. Van Inwagen says, in addition to this concept of an untouchable fact, it's important, according to him, to see that untouchable facts obey what he calls a certain logical principle, which he simply calls principle. Here's what he says. Suppose it's an untouchable fact that P, and suppose also that the following conditional, an if-then statement, expresses an untouchable fact. If P, then Q. It follows from these 2 suppositions that it's an untouchable fact that Q. What's going on here? Well, he's saying this. If it's an untouchable fact that P, where P, fill in for just some sentence or statement, and it's an untouchable fact that if P, then Q, then it's an untouchable fact that Q. Here's another way to put principle. Principle says that every argument of the following form is logically valid. Every argument of the form, premise 1, it's an untouchable fact that P. Premise 2, it's an untouchable fact that if P, then Q. Conclusion, therefore, it's an untouchable fact that Q. Principle says if you swap out P and Q there for any sentence that renders the premises true, you'll then have an argument that renders the conclusion false. Also true. There's no substitution that would make the premises true and the conclusion false. So it's important to note here that principle, this argument form, 1, it's an untouchable fact that P, 2, it's an untouchable fact that if P, then Q, 3, it's an untouchable fact that Q, looks a lot like modus ponens, which we've encountered before. Modus ponens is P, if P, then Q, therefore Q. That's part of the appeal of principle. But there is this phrase on the front of the P, if P then Q, and Q in all three of the argument steps. This phrase, it's an untouchable fact that. And that additional phrase changes the meaning and logical import of the steps of the argument. So you can't just take a valid argument form like modus ponens, add a phrase on the front, and always be guaranteed to get something valid on the other side. Sometimes you can, and it's an interesting question which phrases can be added to a valid argument and secure something valid on the other side, and which can't and why. But Van Inwagen needs to convince us that this is indeed a valid argument form. He can't just say, hey, it's modus ponens, because although it looks like modus ponens, it's not. So Van Inwagen does in fact give us a little defense of principle. He says this: to endorse principle is to endorse the following thesis. Replace the symbols P and Q in principle with any declarative sentence you like. The result will be true. Here is an example that will illustrate what this thesis implies. We replace P with the last dinosaur died out before I was born, and Q with I have never seen a living dinosaur. So let's do that, and this is what Van Inwagen thinks is the basis for accepting principle. So P is the dinosaurs died out before my birth, Q is I've never seen a living dinosaur. Van Inwagen's claim is that if we swap in those English sentences for P's and Q's in our argument form here, what we'll get is true premises and a true conclusion. So let's do that. Let's swap in the dinosaurs died out before my birth for every instance of P in the argument. We'll start with the first premise. The argument now says, at the first premise, it's an untouchable fact that the dinosaurs died out before my birth. True, right? What does it mean for something to be an untouchable fact? Just that no one has ever had the power to do anything about, to change this fact. Neither I nor anyone else can change the fact that the dinosaurs died out when they did. So number one is true. Number two, swapping out P and Q, says it's an untouchable fact that if the dinosaurs died out before my birth, then I've never seen one. In other words, I can't change the fact that their dying out before I was around guarantees that I've never been able to see one. In other words, I can't do anything to change the fact that I can't see things that happened before I was ever born. True. And then the conclusion, we swap in Q there. Therefore, it's an untouchable fact that I've never seen a living dinosaur. Also true. And Van Inwagen says, aha, it's not an accident that we have true premises and a true conclusion here. Any P and Q you could choose that would render the premises true would also render the conclusion true. What does that tell you? That tells you that this argument form is always logically valid wherever it occurs. If you can think of a substitution for P and Q that makes premises true but the conclusion false, then you got a counterexample to principle, and Van Inwagen's argument is not going to work. Conversely, Van Inwagen's argument works only if every substitution that results in true premises